Thank you very much, Sharon, and thanks to the JEIC for hosting us and inviting us to speak to this significant group. As you've heard, part of the reason, perhaps the main reason that we've been invited here is because we recently published a book, Inside Jewish Day Schools. And the purpose of this book was, as the subtitle indicates, to learn more about leadership, learning, and community. The focus of the book was not on meaning, but the book does contain material on meaning. And we actually decided to take as a challenge exploring how does meaning appear in this book. A quick word about the book. As Sharon indicated, the book contains chapters on 9 different Jewish day schools of very different types, scattered in different parts of North America, different sizes, different grades, and so on. And the purpose, again, was to introduce readers to the variety of these places, to indicate just how much Jewish day schools today are different from Jewish day schools 20 years ago, let alone way back in the past century when I was a student in day school. And then also to look at these questions of leadership, learning, and community. But as I said, we took it as a challenge in preparation for today's discussion to think about and to learn, to explore rather, how does meaning appear in our book. And in fact, we were able to extract from that a number of places where the word meaning does appear. Now, Sharon said a few moments ago that we're going to be speaking from the balcony, and later on you'll be learning from one another. In fact, I want to start that learning process from one another now already. So I want you to think about a question, and this will be an exercise for all of us to do together, or individually rather. So first of all, I'd like you to think about an example of how meaning operates, or is enacted, if you will, in your own school. It can be an anecdote, it could be a particular incident, it could be a particular class, whatever comes to mind. And then I want to ask you to look at your devices where we have listed a set of a dozen different quotations from the book, from different chapters in the book, and for you then to link your example, the example you've come up with, to one of those 12. Got it? And then there's going to be another step. And that other step will be to turn to your neighbor and talk with your neighbor briefly about the example you came up with, the quotation you came up with, to see to what extent you think in the same terms, or if you had similar types of experiences. We are obviously not going to spend the whole afternoon doing this, but just a very short amount of time. Well, that led to a lively conversation. I don't know whether it's about this or not, but anyhow. So I have 2 questions for you. Number one, how many of you found that you and the person sitting next to you were talking about a very similar type of meaning making? I see only 2 hands so far, 3. Okay. I'll switch it the other way. How many of you discovered that, in fact, you were on a totally different wavelength in thinking about meaning making from your partner? And the rest of you were just gossiping? Schmoozing? Okay. All right. It's an overture. What can I tell you? Okay. I'm going to hand the floor over now to my friend and colleague, Alex, who is going to explain the meaning of what we just did now.
Okay, so you have 12 pieces of text in front of you, and you've discussed some of them at the very least. So let me just ask a different question now. Put your hand up if you selected either text 3, 6, or 10. 3, 6, or 10. Okay, well, I'm not sure if the people who selected 3, 6, or 10 should really be here. Because the important thing is that there are different ways of talking about meaning. We mean different things about meaning, right? And we don't really want to talk about the sense of meaning in relation to text 3, 6, and 10. Let me explain why. If you would just scroll down that way, there's a flow chart underneath the set of text, right? In the top left-hand corner, so see this flow chart as a meaning-making map, right? Those who know their Harry Potter, because I come from the land of Harry Potter, you may be familiar with the Marauder's map in Harry Potter. Well, this is your meaning-making map. And you see at the top there, it says making sense and creating significance. In everyday speech, when we say to someone, what do you mean? What does that mean, right? They could be referring to one of these two understandings of the word. They could be making sense of something, or they could be making significance of something. In other words, we ask of the text, what does it mean? But we could also say, what does it mean to you, right? So extracts 3, did I say 6, I think, and 10 are all examples of making sense. For example, number 3, at the best moments, no, that's not. I've got number 3 over here, give me 1 second. Can someone read to us number 3?
It is number 3.
It is number 3?
Yeah.
At the best moments, teachers step back and their boys figure out things for themselves, debating the meaning of a point of the text and collecting beliefs.
Exactly. It is simply, we want to make sure that they understand what the text says, right? It's about making sense of the text. And if you look at that blue thing, making sense, underneath there are 3 examples of how we make sense of text. We contextualize it, we translate it, we explain it. But the focus is not on me or you, it's on understanding the text. So when we talk about meaning, we want to distinguish, there's nothing wrong with that, because that's a fundamental, foundational task in the classroom. But that's one thing we mean when we're talking about meaning. So let's now move along to the right, creating significance, right? Now there are 2 ways of making meaning in respect to creating significance. And you can see underneath that creating significance block, it says extrinsic significance and intrinsic significance. What's the difference between extrinsic and intrinsic? Well, basically the answer is immediately underneath. Extrinsic means ultimately this is going to be consequential for you. Ultimately it really will have meaning for you. And intrinsic is right here and now, it's immediately consequential. So very quickly, not going to give you 5 minutes, going to give you 30 seconds. If you didn't choose 3, 6, or 10, but you chose something else, determine with the person you're sitting next to, is your example an example of intrinsic or extrinsic significance? Paul, put your hand up if you really chose it. Well, this is why this group is gathered here, because most people are interested in intrinsic significance. Put your hand up if you chose intrinsic significance. Many more people. This is interesting, because if you think about making meaning in Jewish day schools, I'm prepared to bet that most of the time, when we aim to cultivate meaning, we're really talking about ultimately significant. What do I mean by that? If you go down the page, forms of competency. A lot of the time, a lot of what we do in Jewish day schools is about developing competencies in ritual, learning how to daven, learning how to pray, learning how to find your way around the text, put the text together, learning how to speak in a language as in your first language, right? Or learning how to interact with people, or learning how to do things so you might make a contribution in society. When will that be significant? Sometime. It will be significant eventually, right? When you've got the skills, it's going to be really significant. But you've got to get those skills first before it's really significant, right? And here's the challenge, is that for some kids, the moment of significance never comes. It's delayed. It's delayed too long. It's going to happen next year. It will happen when you're an adult. Or that Hebrew is going to be really useful when you go on the Israel trip in 7 years' time, right? That's the kind of delayed extrinsic significance, right? So we put on the side making sense. We've got creating significance of an extrinsic, ultimately, it's going to happen. And then we've got intrinsic significance, right? So now if we drill down into those things that are immediately consequential, what do they look like? And what does it feel like? We talk about making meaning, but what do we really mean? What do we understand when we use those words, making meaning? There are 3 suggestions in the box at the bottom of that column. We're not suggesting that those are comprehensive, but these seem to be some of the most common ways of generating immediately consequential significance for the learner. The thing we are doing is inspiring, right? We do this thing and it inspires us to do something else, okay? Or they're clarifying. By doing this thing or by studying this thing, we suddenly see something we didn't understand before, or they're connecting. The significance comes from a connection I form with the thing I'm studying or with the people who are around me, right? Not suggesting that those are the only ways of generating significance, but when we looked at the 12 extracts that we pulled out from the book, we noticed that these things keep coming up, clarifying, helping children see something about the world through Jewish lenses that they didn't imagine before, inspiring them to want to be a certain kind of person, inspiring them to want to do certain kinds of Jewish things, to act in certain kinds of ways. And most profoundly, there's one quotation in there that comes from a focus group of 12 grade students who talked about what they derived from a Jewish education, and they used the language of meaning, but finding a meaningful community, a community in which they belong, perhaps one of the most powerful dimensions of a Jewish day school education. Realizing that you're part of something larger, something significant in the world. Okay? So we try to distinguish for you with this map a way of navigating the conversations in the next 24 hours about meaning. When are we talking about making sense? When are we talking about making significance? And when is that significance immediate? And when is it delayed? It would be irresponsible of us to just leave it there. We want to call out some of the obstacles or the downside of focusing so heavily on meaning. What are the obstacles, first of all? Like, what gets in the way of making meaning? Quick example. We observed a wonderful thing in a classroom, one of the schools we visited, that at the start of the Jewish studies class, we make a bracha. Before we do anything, we make a bracha on learning Torah, right? And that gave the moment meaning. Okay, not every school does this, not every class does this, but what happens when you make a bracha every day, a number of times a day, week after week, month after month? It's the same as any kind of praying. The routine diminishes the meaning of the moment. What had intent to make meaning lost its meaning there and then, right? Culturally inaccessible. Something may be meaningful to you and to me, right? Because we inhabit this world. But what if somebody comes from outside our immediate world? They don't really understand what we're talking about. Developmentally inappropriate. There are texts that we study that are profoundly challenging and